Good afternoon. It's another beautiful day in the Valley of Paradise. Temperature 75, clear skies, no humidity. Today, Jonathan Canning, director and curator and everything else at the Brauer Museum of Art. Oh, Jonathan was going to introduce me to introduce him, but we skipped that. Well, maybe you can introduce me to say goodnight or something like that. Jonathan's going to speak about art in the modern city. His focus, Chicago between the years 1900 and 1950. Jonathan Canning was born in California but grew up in Canterbury, England, where likely his interest in medieval architecture was born and nurtured. Jonathan earned his undergraduate degree from the Courtauld Institute, a college of the University of London, and has earned advanced degrees in art history from the University of Delaware and Columbia University. He has worked as a museum professional and teacher since 1990 at such distinguished institutions as the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the New York Historical Society, the Jewish Museum, and the Cloisters Museum in New York. For 9 years, he served as curator and then senior curator of the Darcy Collection at the Loyola University Museum in Chicago. Jonathan went from there to be a curator of the Hyde Collection in Glens Falls, New York. Having worked almost 6 years at the Hyde, he had become director of curatorial affairs and programming there when we recruited him to be our director. That happened in 2022, right? Yes. And since that time, Jonathan has brought new life to the museum, and his professional and personal skills are abundantly evident in the exhibits you see around you, in the attendance figures that keep rising, in the program he's helping to create. Without further ado, please join me with a warm round of applause for our director, Jonathan Canning.
Thank you. So is this the moment that I admit that I, in all of my academic career, never took one course in American art? Which is why this job is so thrilling, because every day is a learning experience for me as I discover new things and actually begin to acquire a knowledge of American art. My talk today is meant to move us away from the Art History 102 perception of early American modernism, particularly in Chicago. I think the basic story is that modernism arrives with the 1913 Armory show in New York. A version of it is shown here in Chicago, and there's such a conservative reaction against Picasso, Gauguin, Rodin, and European modernism that Chicago remains something of a backwater. Until after World War II. And in general, the history of 20th century art is seen as a conflict between representational art and abstraction, with abstraction winning out in the 1940s and coming to dominate until there's a sort of revival in the second half. And that somehow Chicago always sort of lags behind, and then with the return of representation, Chicago sort of catches up. And what I want to do today is to suggest that early American modernism was seeking its own identity separate from European modernism, and that representation is always going to be an essential element, but on a sliding scale. I think you can see that if you just scan the wall behind me. We go from sort of social realism and George Bellows at one end to Marin and Arthur Dove at the other. But I'm going to argue that there is a sort of flow along a continuum. And one of the reasons I want to do this is because I don't want us to see our collection at the Brauer, which I enjoy very much and find so interesting to delve into, particularly in this early 20th century period, as conservative, tradition-bound. The artists are, each one of them is trying to explore this notion of how do you modernize the tradition of Western art and revive it, and where along this sort of continuum from traditional representation all the way to pure abstraction do you go? And I think in Europe they're willing to go all the way to fracturing form in Cubism, extraordinary color in Fauvism and post-impressionism, but the Americans aren't quite always willing to go so far. And I think it's important that we don't think that our collection, which is strong between the pieces on this wall and the south wall of the 20th Century Gallery that was rehung in November, we don't see that as behind the times or failing to keep up with advancement, that in fact they're part of this dialogue that was taking place in the first part of the 20th century amongst American artists. I overheard on the radio this morning that today is the 517th anniversary of the publication of the Martin Waldseemüller map, which is the first map to have America identified on it. And so that seemed fitting as I'm trying to argue that there's a particular form of American early modernism that we can sort of follow in our collection. So, right at the beginning of the 20th century, with our print there of George Bellows introducing George Carpentier from 1921. We also have the small John Sloan here, Rooftop Summer Nights from 1906. We see a group of American artists under the tutelage of Robert Henry, the Ashcan School as they were sometimes known, exploring who is a suitable subject for art. Who in America? So they're abandoning a Western tradition of aristocrats in the fête champêtre of Baroque Europe. Even the middle-class flaneur or stroller of Impressionist Paris. And they are creating art that incorporates the average American. And who was that at the beginning of the 20th century? Well, there was a huge influx. I think over 14 million immigrants came in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And they're from everywhere, and they are living cheek by jowl in these sort of nasty tenement buildings. And they have their own forms of entertainment. So boxing was not totally legal at this time, and yet Bellows becomes famous for his boxing paintings and prints. And you can see the crowd here. They're clearly city dwellers, out having a good time, men and women mixing together. We have a policeman leading off a thief, a pickpocket probably in the bottom left corner. We have cameras up, so modern technology and mass media is recording this event. And then on the horizon, we've got some simple farm buildings silhouetted, and perhaps that's the origins of the two healthy-looking fighters who are preparing to box. And then in other works of this series, it's the thrill of the physical exercise, and he's able to convey all the energy wound up in the muscular bodies of the boxers as they let loose their jabs and their punches. And then the raucous response of the crowd. And none of that had really been seen in European art. It was a little too close to reality and common life. And yet American artists are identifying that as something they want as an element of in the new modern American life. I like this print of families sleeping on the rooftops of their tenements, hot, sultry summer night. Families move up. There's no privacy up here. And you can see that there's a solitary man here with his arms over some rolled up piece of clothing that's acting as a pillow, and he is staring across at this lady who's asleep with her husband next to her, the family around her, and she's turned in such a way as you can't tell. Are her eyes open? Is she aware of him looking at her? Is something going on here between the two of them? There's a sort of a tension that's introduced, and this again is an aspect of living. It's social realism. It's truth as lived as these families lived their lives in these packed tenement buildings, and yet it's now become the subject of art. And it's if you look at the way these are both executed in print, particularly the etching here, Slane's can be very refined. The very last piece is a very elegant etched image of a female nude by John Slane from 1945 or so, I think. But he can also be very rough and scratchy and look unfinished, and I think that quality is deliberate because of the image he's trying to create, the social class, the world that he's trying to capture. It's not refined and polished and beautiful. And he wants his image to look as rough and gritty as the scene he's depicting. And we could also, in terms of thinking about social realism and who's the subject of art, add in our girl walking by Reginald Marsh in the 20th Century Gallery. So in this talk, I'm going to bounce back and forth between the wall behind me and the wall you can't see, but it's in the 20th Century Gallery, and I know that you know it quite well. So Marsh is fascinated by all these young women who are beginning professional lives in the cities. They work as secretaries and shop assistants, and for the first time they have some independence. They can go out and about in the city free from family and sort of the paternal eye, and that was an element of liberation, but it was also very unsettling in American society to have all these unescorted women. And you can't help but notice that Reginald Marsh has a male gaze. His women are young and firm, and their skirts are short, and they are, if they are painted, the oil is loose and fluid, and it seems sort of transparent, and you think about their clothing and his gaze on these women wandering around town, striding with confidence. They always have confidence, but there's a sort of uneasiness about society allowing these women out and about on their own. So this is an aspect of what a modern American art in the 20th century is going to look like, who it's going to represent, the stories it's going to tell, the stories it's going to elevate to be the subject of art, and free it from the sort of aristocratic snobbiness of the European world. And then I want to draw your attention to this work by Richard Chase, and then there's another in the 20th Century Gallery called Rough Stuff. So American artists celebrated the American city. It's a center of great wealth. It's a center of incredible expansion. And here we have them celebrating not the grand buildings and the allées, the processional ways that you would find in a European city that would be painted, Pall Mall in London, the Champs-Élysées in Paris, the Haussmann Boulevards, that sort of a theme. Here we are actually down on the tracks. And this steam locomotive is going to come noisily, clattering, clanking, blowing out steam, rushing past us. And the buildings that we see are the red brick factories and warehouses, and then the soaring skyscrapers. The skyscraper is this new architectural phenomenon invented in Chicago and celebrated as an American building form. And this is all the subject that Richard Chase made the subject of his own art. He became famous for his portrayals of the architecture and the industrial life of Chicago. I think in this one he is paying homage to 19th century French Impressionism, and particularly Monet. You may know Monet's Gare at Saint-Lazare. The steam engine comes into the station, lets off a big billowing cloud of steam that dissolves the lattice work of the iron and glass ceiling above in the station. And so here we have these clouds that break down and obscure the lattice of the signaling gantry, and that he creates these flattened planes in the picture that suddenly dissolve into cloud. And I think he's not only looking at Impressionism, but he's looking at we see here the influence of Japanese screen painting and prints, where they use clouds to break up the narrative of stories and to break up the various panels in their screens. It looks from a distance that he's using a subdued palette of colors, because this is gritty, the gritty railroad tracks of Chicago, and so we've got silvers and grays, reddish brown brick. But actually, if you come close, you'll see these bright use of of blue here dotted throughout, and it helps to enliven and innovate the image. I'll come back to color in a moment, because use of color is going to be a particular trait of American modernists in a way somewhat different from the Europeans. In his other painting, which is in the other gallery, Tough Stuff, you'll see a scene of the water's edge in downtown Chicago, men working. There's a man on a boat tying it up against the pier, and the shooting through the picture in the foreground from bottom edge to top edge of the frame are these various diagonal lines from the pier and the gantry and a mast and some chains. And this cropping of the image, this restricting of your view within the city because of these architectural or industrial elements, that's something that we see here in this print by John Marin. He's an American artist who had been to Europe. He had seen Cubism firsthand. And I think we see in both works, the Chase and the Marin, the influence of Cubism, but not the exaggerated, radical shattering of form, but rather these jagged, sharp lines. Particularly the elevated here, this is called Downtown L from 1921, and you've got this dark gash of the elevated track cutting through the image. It's disrupting your reading of the soaring lines of the skyscrapers. It's casting the lower half in shadow, and then you've got these sort of exciting zigzag lines, disrupting your field and introducing a sense of energy and action and noise and bustle. And you can imagine the screech of the L-train metal wheels on the track, and the grinding sound, and that sort of disorienting experience as you walk through downtown Chicago and then under the tracks of the L, and it suddenly gets dark and these strange patterns and shadows are cast, and buildings constrict your view, and then get around a corner, it opens up again. All of that sensation of the vitality of being in the city, of these strange views that open and close down on you, of the noise, of the action, of the movement. All of that Marin is trying to convey in this small print through these use of jagged, sharp, scratchy lines. And he's been influenced by Cubism. This is how they're this is how they've decided, how do we introduce noise and confusion and movement into a painting or into art that's use jagged lines and breaking forms, disrupting your reading of space. But we still have a strong sense of representation here. We can still ground ourselves. We can still identify clearly the soaring upper stages of skyscrapers, where the ground is, flagpoles, etc. So we can orient ourselves within the cityscape. And I think to a degree you have the same thing in the Chase painting in the other room, where he breaks up space. Sometimes it is obstructed, sometimes he flattens the surface of the painting, and then other times you've got a glimpse through across the river to another building lit by sunlight, hazy blue sky, and this sort of push and pull of the flat surface of the painting, but yet it's suggesting 3 dimensions and a distant vista. All of this is grounds for artists to play with as they try to modernize the Western tradition of representational painting, and suggesting 3 dimensions and a flat pattern at the same time. But these American artists, John Marin, New York-based, and Richard Chase here in Chicago, they are avoiding going so to the radical extreme of Picasso's Cubism. So I want to turn to, you could ask the question, how well did they know European modernism? Marin was lucky, he went to Europe for a while, but really that's the importance of 1913 and the Armory Show. It's an exhibition that was conceived of by a number of artists, John Sloan, Walter Kuhn, George Bellows, William Glackens. They were all behind bringing this massive exhibition of over 1,000 pieces of European modernism, but also precursors, the work of artists they thought from a century or two before had inspired contemporary artists to rethink and revitalize the Western tradition. So Velázquez and Goya were included in the New York version of the Armory show, as well as Picasso, Matisse, Manet, Van Gogh. When it came to Chicago, the show, I think everybody knows that the show got terrible reviews in the press. They loathed Matisse. They made fun of Cubism, and there was a story in one of the Chicago papers of a young girl whose mother asked, "How many people do you see in the picture?" And the girl replies, "I think I see one." Is it a puzzle picture? And the mother says, "No, it's of a dancer dancing." And it was called The Dance at Spring by Francis Picabia. And then the girl turns to her mother and says, "It's gone. I can't see it anymore. Oh, mother, lead me away. I feel dizzy." And so that's the sort of foolish reporting that the Chicago papers are full of when the exhibition is on. Now, it's a much more finely honed version of the show than was shown in New York. So about half the paintings came. And the Art Institute didn't take any of the historical precursors. They said, we either have them in our collection or people know them. Let's just take the living modernists in the main. The president of the Art Institute was not in town for the 3 weeks that the show was here, and he wrote disparaging comments about the artists and much of the art that was on view. The secretary to the lecturers at the School of the Art Institute taught classes in the galleries and heavily critiqued the shows publicly to their students. And then the secretary of the Art Institute wrote to the absent director, "I was afraid our students might get sidetracked in some way by the exhibition. I feel that the exhibition will not only do them no harm, but on the contrary, will get them conversant with the movement with which they will have nothing to do." So, and quite famously, at the end of the exhibition, the students of the Art Institute put Henri Matisse, or Hairy Mattress, as they called him, on trial and burnt 3 or 4 of his replicas of his paintings. And so that's generally how people think Chicago responded to the Armory show and their experience of European modernism. Actually, I think American artists, it was the extremes that they couldn't quite handle. Matisse's really bright colors and loosely drawn human figures. Duchamp's nude descending a staircase, this sort of broken, jagged, chattery human figure that they couldn't quite read. But there were other artists, particularly, I think, the color of the Fauvists that American artists immediately responded to. So I think initially what you see is a revitalization of color. And I think we find that in our pile driver that's painted by John Sloan in our 20th century gallery. So look, I've now sort of beamed it with light so that it brings out the bright blues, the zip lines of yellow that shoot up the masts, the strong orange of the pile driver boat and the reflection it has in the water. That is John Sloan responding to the extraordinary freedom of color that he sees amongst some of the European modernists at the 1913 Armory Show. In Chicago, we see that being picked up by an artist like Emil Arman. He's in the other gallery too. In his painting of the Chicago River and the look at his use of color. Again, there's yellow and orange, green, bright blue, squeezed right out of the tube and applied directly onto the canvas. There's a childlike vitality in the piece, and even a simplification of form. So there's this childlike drawing of a boat in the Chicago River. But he's trying to capture, again, he wants to capture the energy, the exuberance of a city like Chicago. And he's finding that he can do it in color while remaining clearly representational in his depiction of buildings and a sense of depth in the picture. It's the vitality of color that Emil Arman picks up. And he got that from the Fauvists, from the post-impressionists. So there are elements that American modernists are going to pick up on. It's the radical rejection of realism, my argument is, that just Americans don't really go for. Next to me here, you see a work by Väinö Hänel, and I think he's being influenced by the Italian futurists. And it's interesting that this is the production line. In the other room, we have a painting called Steel Production, Steel Making. And the titles are about the mechanical process. They're not about the person. And futurism was all about these new industries. They were fascinated by new materials, new industry, by mechanization, by speed. They introduced notions of speed and action and vitality through repeated forms, repetition. At the same time, they tended to anonymize the human figure, to make it more mechanical. I think we see that here in these rather robot-looking heads. The sense of strength through the well-rounded shoulders, upper torsos, and the arms, but the fingers are almost like mechanical claws. None of the faces are personalized in any way. The futurists love violence, and you've a sense of that. Here's the overseer's hand with a whip that cracks across about the lower third of the gouache, and then here is a figure pulling on a rope. We've got figures chained here. So this is a somewhat disturbing image, what has happened to man in pursuit of production and mechanization. The Italian futurists looked forward to World War I. They backed World War I because they thought we needed a cleansing cataclysm to clear out, to revitalize European society. That's not what the Americans are trying to do in their concept of modernizing the tradition and making a modern American art. But you do see someone like Hänel here, who's adopting these forms that we will see in the development of Art Deco. These rounded shapes, they're sort of pleasing as a pattern until you start reading them as cogs, human cogs in a production line. There's a reaction, since we know how history ends in the 20th century, we've tended to create a sense of a through line through the century. And one of my concerns when we think of how we tell the story of early modernism is that we think it was always leading towards abstraction. And there is a reaction in the 1930s, and that is the movement of regionalism. And I was surprised in reading up on regionalism and the comments of artists like Thomas Hart Benton, the language that they used to critique modernist artists. And it seemed very much like contemporary culture wars now. They are insane. They are unpatriotic. And in fact, one of the great criticisms of American artists, if they become too radical, if they become too European, is that they're non-American. They're too German. They're too French. But this is an old accusation. So I found this interesting quote about Mary Cassatt's mural in 1893 at the Columbian World's Fair. And there was in the women's building, there was a mural by Mary Cassatt, and there was one by Mrs. McMonnies. Mrs. McMonnies was a traditional academic artist. She did sylvan nymphs in a glade, and then you had Mary Cassatt, an impressionist, modern women in various pursuits. Mrs. McMonnies addresses the eye in gentle and insinuating fashion. Miss Cassatt does not address the eye at all. She assaults it. Mrs. McMonnies' tone is light and silvery, while the impudent greens and brutal blues of Miss Cassatt seem to indicate an aggressive personality with which compromise and cooperation would be impossible. Indeed, Miss Cassatt has a reputation for being strong and daring. She works with men in Paris on their own ground. So this idea of an independent woman, Mary Cassatt was one of the creators of Impressionism. It didn't do her reputation well in late 19th century America. And again, this accusation of the colors are too bright, they're too aggressive, that you can be too European and foreign and not following the niceties of American society. That is an accusation that is brought out again against American artists who are too abstract, too transgressive, as early modernism moves along this continuum, as I've been trying to argue, between representation and pure abstraction. There was a Cubist artist called Dawson in Chicago in 1913. But in general, he was really on his own. I want to look at artists I think managed to be both very abstract and modern, and at the same time retains just enough representation that the American sensibility can accept where they are pushing art and where they're working. And so we have our John Marin here. So he's Cubist and aggressive with his action lines, innovating city scenes in his etchings, and then in his landscapes he creates, he was recognized as America's finest watercolorist of the 1920s and 30s. He's a member of the Stieglitz Circle of artists, along with Marston Hartley, Arthur Dove, and Georgia O'Keeffe. He follows in the tradition of Winslow Homer, of George Bellows, John Sloan, of American artists who find respite from their winters working and teaching in the city and depicting American urban life by going to Maine and the coast of Maine in the summers and painting landscape. And his landscapes are both recognizable, but he uses a shorthand of pattern and abstraction in creating them that allows you to see them more as color patterns and not necessarily as the traditional American landscape. And if I didn't tell you that this painting by Dove is called Brown Sun and Housetop, would you read that as a representational image at all? Dove, as early as 1912, was exhibiting in Chicago these densely packed, rather flat, floral and vegetal curvilinear formed watercolors. And Chicago accepted them. So this is even before the Armory show has shown here in the city. And they're able to see that he's trying to capture emotion, that he's abstracting from the natural world. He's making pattern, but they're also reading it as vegetation and foliate forms. That we're continuing to read Dove in some way as a representational image, although we could see this as purely abstract forms and colors on a page. Dove and Marin are never fully rejected because I think they're retaining just enough of the representational world within this circle of Stieglitz that Stieglitz is promoting to collectors and museums. That America, they're never fully, they're not cast out. And they are helping to push and explore what modernism can be in pre-World War II America. They've taken abstraction, I think, as far as you can go. And the supreme artist in this of this period is, I think, Georgia O'Keeffe. And our landscape by O'Keeffe is, again, this wonderful combination of representational landscape and abstraction and form, and a modernist reinterpretation of the landscape to make it relevant, suggest its modernity, and appeal to the American spirit. And I think it's some aspect of the American spirit that holds nature and representation very close and very dear. And this is why American artists will not fully reject it in the way that there are European artists who can. I think it's too embedded in the American spirit of a wild, powerful, majestic nature, a natural setting that has been laid open to the American settlers, that is to be exploited, is to be venerated, that is the driving force of the American spirit that we see exploding in these massive teeming cities and vibrant industrial heartlands and bases that causes American artists who are exploring modernism in the first part of the 20th century never to fully reject it in the European way. And I think there's that, and what we see in our collection is how Chicago-based artists and collectors, including our primary collector, Percy Sloan, keep honor and retain this tradition of the representing the natural world. They will move a long way towards total abstraction, as you can see here, but they'll never quite make the break in the way the European artists will. I think it's just something core to the American experience. That break doesn't come till after the war, and then I think the horrors of the war are one of the reasons that happens in America as well as around the world. So those are my thoughts on early American, on particularly our collection of early American modernism, where it's going, what it's trying to do, the traditions it's trying to energize and invent for America, and the fact that it never quite wants to break with representation fully. Thank you very much.
Are there questions or comments? I will come to you. Yes, John.
He's part of, so what we did was take down part of Sarah Jansi's show, and Chagall is just the leftover from Sarah Jansi. I forgot to actually mention the Stieglitz picture, which I wanted to include in my talk, because although we think of that, we often teach that in terms of social history, of immigrants coming to America, Stieglitz actually saw that wholly in pictorial terms of what I was saying with the Marin, of these lines. How do you introduce movement and modernism and busy activity? You disrupt the image with these diagonal lines and repeated shapes. So a funnel goes one way, a gangplank goes another. There are echoes of round funnel shapes throughout the picture, contrasts of black and white. He saw that picture wholly in pictorial compositional terms, and it's elements that other artists picked up here, and definitely with Chase, without going the whole hog and disrupting form and figure as the Cubists would.
Thank you for that question. How about another question or comments? Sarah. Man, hold, wait, so that we have one person, Glenn Roberts, wants to listen to your question.
Oh, okay. Now I'm nervous. I was just gonna say it. I think it's interesting that you mentioned briefly that after the war, that's really when we started to break from realism in the US, or at least representation, right? This abstract expressionist movement that just started as this like internal angst against beauty and probably against some of the politics of the time, or all of the politics of the time, and that feeling of loss and anger. And I think it's interesting that we've got these pieces up here that are all kind of like celebrating, even if it's rough and tumble, it's celebrating and kind of leaning into what's American. And then you have like the abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock and Franz Klein, who just like were attacking canvases on large, European scale canvases. So.
I read somewhere that Vin Hanel and others were influenced by Saul Bellow, who for a period of time was at the Art Institute. And I've been trying to find that ever since, and I can't find it. So
George Bellows, not the author, the painter. Yes. George Bellows taught 1919 to 1920 at the Art Institute.
Okay.
And I think, so Hanel is going to be the subject of next summer's exhibition, when a number of regional arts organizations will be holding exhibitions about both Vin and Hazel Hanel. So we're going to continue looking at and trying to learn American modernism, but by focusing on Vin Hanel as a modernist. But at the Depression, they moved to Furnaceville, and then his style changes. I think he moves more towards regionalism and a return to representation and to storytelling about the American farm, life rooted on the land, as opposed to these industrial images. But I haven't totally worked out what's going on there yet.
Anyone else? Here's a question.
Was the Armory on Navy Pier? Was that where that was?
The show was held at the Art Institute, in the galleries of the Art Institute. And one thing I wanted, the last piece, which I wanted to draw your attention to, and this is just because it was a discovery I made in the collection. It's a drawing. I identified it as a nude by John Slane. It is dated 1945, and there's an inscription. He gave this piece to Francis Stain Beazle, who was a regional artist married to Fred Beazle, an artist. They both knew both Vin and Hazel Hanel. They're part of the Furnaceville group. And he presents the etching to her, thanking her for her work in his University of Chicago exhibition at the Renaissance Society in 1945. So the Renaissance Society, which continues to promote contemporary art in Chicago, was founded 2 years after the Armory show. So even if the press and the general public made fun of what they saw, the artistic world and patrons in Chicago followed up very quickly with the formation of the Arts Club, the Renaissance Society, and artists like Slane were exhibited and brought back. So I was excited to find this sort of personal connection between John Slane and Chicago artists in our collection.
Just a minute. I see a familiar face.
Jonathan, I'm not sure if you know, because how much you've looked at the collection, but you know our Gertrude Abercrombie, very small little teeny painting. There's an FS painted in the very middle of the snail. It's Francis
Strain.
Yeah, so it's another connection, with other artists at that time.
So I hope to winkle out more of these connections as part of the Hanel project with Poco Muse, Chesterton Arts Center, Pines Village, Westchester Library, and others. We're all going to tell a little bit of the story of the Hanels and their artist community established in Furnaceville in the 30s and onwards.
And I would point out that chase was part of Percy Sloane's personal collection.
Yes.
As well as the chase in the 20th Century Gallery. And I love teaching Carl Sandburg's poem, Chicago, and that could be the illustration of Chicago, city of big shoulders, hog butcher of the world. Any other questions? Jonathan, you've stunned us into silence. Thank you. We're back next week, the same place. Gloria Ruff, another museum professional, long history here, she's going to speak as a photographer about certain black and white photographs in the collection that she will use to talk about certain technical aspects of photography. So you don't want to miss that. So thanks for being here. great house, great questions. Jonathan, good job. And make sure that you spend a little bit of time in the gallery because those works are wonderful.